About the 19th Amendment. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified to prohibit states from denying male citizens the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And people love to point out that black men were granted the right to vote in the Constitution before black women were. But yeah, don't do that. While it is true that after the Civil War, black men did vote, were allowed to vote under the 15th Amendment for Reconstruction governments across the South, particularly, let's not forget that white men put an end to Reconstruction violently. Lynching and white riots and the Klan and vigilante murders. And the 13th Amendment was ratified the same year that the Civil War ended, made it easier for states to take advantage of the exception clause of that amendment to ramp up institutional efforts to criminalize black men, to not only return them to bondage, but to take away that right to vote that the 15th Amendment supposedly guaranteed because they were criminals. But the 14th Amendment that was ratified in July 1868 that repealed the 3/5 clause of the Constitution and that was supposed to ensure that all male citizens over age 21, no matter their race, had a right to vote. But that amendment also has an exception clause, and we don't ever talk about that because Section 2 of that amendment, the 14th, puts forth that states that disenfranchise eligible men from voting will have their representation in Congress reduced by the proportional number of men denied the vote, except if those men were denied the vote, quote, for participation in rebellion or other crime. Those three little words, or other crime, in the 14th Amendment, drafted by the so-called anti-slavery Republicans now, don't ever forget that, set in motion the widespread disenfranchisement of black men from the ballot box. 5 states had already passed felony disenfranchisement laws by 1840. By the time the Civil War ended, about 24 states had some form of felony disenfranchisement policy or similar provisions in their state constitution. But that little clause in the 14th Amendment gave 4 more states the impetus to enact felony disenfranchisement laws and another constitutional vehicle to criminalize black men to deny them the vote. And this effort continues to this very day. So, nope. Not buying the argument that black men got their voting rights when black women didn't. On paper, sure, but what really happens tells a whole nother story. But this celebration every year of the 19th Amendment also bothers me because people love to point out how on August 18th, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, granting women the right to vote. Yes, the amendment does say, quote, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. But every year, we have to remind people that black women were not included in this amendment, nor were Native American women, nor were Asian women, nor were Latinx or Mexican women. While it is true that states could and did use poll taxes and other voter suppression tactics already used across the country to deny voting rights to black men, to also later keep black women from voting, they could and did use those same tactics against Latinx women, indigenous women, and many Asian women who lacked citizenship in 1920, meaning they couldn't vote in the first place. But white women? I don't think any of that happened a lot to white women. Look, I'm sure there were some efforts to keep women from exercising their rights to vote on some level, but whatever they were, it was never on the scale of the sustained and concerted efforts to keep black people and other non-white people from voting. I think the 19th Amendment might be one of the few times in the history of passing laws in this country when white men were like, well, okay then, and just pretty much did what the law said they should do, which was to not stop white women from voting, white women. And this idea that white women generally fought for the right to vote for black people after the 19th Amendment was passed, well, no. Some did, yes, but the heroines of the suffragette movement and many white women in the suffragette movement, well, they were racist. They were mad that black men got the vote before they did, and they didn't want black women to have the vote with them. And I'm not making this up, because even among the most prominent white suffragettes, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were at one time part of the American Equal Rights Association, a group they formed with Frederick Douglass, who was a staunch suffragist, and other activists in 1866. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton said at one time, quote, "We educated, virtuous white women are more worthy of the vote in the context of black men and black women not being worthy at all." And then there was no unity with black women, as she said that if black folks were allowed to vote, then black women would find an even worse slavery under black men than they did under their former white slave owners. And then Susan B. Anthony said when she refused to support the 15th Amendment that Frederick Douglass supported that enfranchised black men, Anthony said, quote, "Think of Patrick and I can't say that word, but it starts with an S and ends with an O, and Hans and Young Tung, who do not know the difference between a monarchy and a republic, who cannot read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's spelling book, making laws for Susan B. Anthony. The 15th Amendment creates an antagonism everywhere between educated, refined women and the lower orders of men, especially in the South." Gee, I wonder what lower orders of men she was talking about. She made it very clear. Black men, immigrant men, Asian men, everybody but white men. She even asks Frederick Douglass not to appear on stage at a suffrage event because it would have been unseemly for him to be up there on the stage with white women. And let's not ever forget the massive 1913 suffragette march in New York City, when the organizers told black suffragette organizations to march in the back of the procession apart from the white suffragettes. So in 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified, black and other non-white women still could not vote. And they formed their own suffragette organizations. And when they tried to reach out to the main suffrage organizations at the time, they were ignored. Listen, I was born in 1967. My grandmama voted for the first time in her life just 2 years before I was born. She was 39 years old. The 19th Amendment gave white women only the right to vote in 1920. So I'm not entirely sure what people expect women like me to celebrate, especially since black people are still fighting for the right to unrestricted access to the ballot box to this day. In the words of Dr. Jemima Pierre, we just live here. None of these laws were written for us. Follow Luke Mon Nation on patreon.com/LukeMonNation for lots of great content.